Yesterday, the MC for the day was David Erickson, so he kind of introduced himself. A couple of months ago, we were in Burkina Faso at the forum that we were having in Ouagadougou, and we were just sitting around and talking. And as we were chatting, we were talking about all the mining companies that were coming into Burkina and throughout that region, up into Niger and Mali, various areas, and we talked. For some reason, we started talking about uranium mining, and David said, "Oh, that reminds me. I did my thesis on uranium mining," and he had this whole explanation that we didn't understand anything about. But David is a man of many talents, and most of them are hidden, and unless you hit a trigger point, he won't even reveal these various things in his life. But David is serving as the Chief Organizational Development Officer at ECHO. That basically means he's in charge of our regional offices as well as the development office, which is kind of the PR communications area. David has a degree, an undergrad degree in economics from Harvard, and political science, as well as a master's degree there from Harvard in public policy. One of the things that ECHO has been more consciously aware of and wanting to be more significantly involved in, and you perhaps have gathered threads of that throughout this particular conference, but we are wanting to be more intentional in terms of the economic components that we talk about for agriculture. David is well qualified to talk in terms of the economics, and we're excited about him coming up and sharing with you this morning. Would you please welcome David Erickson?
Thank you, Tim. I was going to say, and now for something completely different. I have really enjoyed our time this morning and the sharing about Artemisian tea, and my mouth is still a little bit puckered from the tea, but I can feel the health pouring into my systems. Also, a word of warning, Bill Mabane said that everybody hates charts. Just so you can have a little bit of time to prepare yourself, I've got a couple of charts, so you can gear yourself up for that. There was a little concern, you've heard Karen Trom's name. Karen was a little concerned that this talk maybe should have a title that was a little bit more robust and would communicate very clearly to the audience in more academic terms what we're going to talk about. So I want you to have a minute to absorb this title. Toward an understanding of resource employment patterns of agricultural agents involved in small-scale enterprise and the pecuniary expression of these patterns. So you probably now know everything you need to know, and like Gene said this morning, I could just sit down, so you've got it all. For the rest of us, this is the title of the talk, Economics of Small-Scale Farming. The economics part is maybe pretty obvious to most of you, but you might wonder why bother with small-scale farming. I think it's the dynamics on this issue have shifted significantly in the last few years around the world, but there have been a lot of people that think it's a waste of time. We shouldn't bother with small-scale farmers. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. There's a lot of great literature on this, but just to highlight a few reasons why I think it's really important that we bother with small-scale farming and farmers. One is that they exist around the world in huge numbers. If you define a small-scale farm as 2 hectares or smaller, there are over 450 million small-scale farmers around the world. And on these farms live over 2 billion people. So if we're interested in having an impact and a relevance to what's going on in the world, small-scale farmers represent that. In addition, small-scale farms are economically efficient. They very effectively use labor, and especially labor in relation to the very modest capital investments. Third is the small-scale farms provide a really critical opportunity for employment, and an employment that would not be available in most developing countries for the people that do live on the farms. And so if they weren't small-scale farmers, they would be in huge proportions unemployed. Related to that is poverty. You often heard that approximately 70% of the poorest people in the world live in rural areas, and most of those live on farms. And so if we want, again, to impact the rates, the levels of poverty, making a difference with small-scale farmers is a really significant way to do that. Closely related to that is food security. Malnutrition and hunger is, again, most prevalent in rural areas. We, by increasing productivity and improving livelihoods among small-scale farmers, can have a huge impact on not only poverty but food security. And as we know, it's the poor people in the world that suffer most as prices of staples and food products increase. And so we can not only make a big difference in the availability levels of food around the world, but on a larger scale, food security issues on a countrywide basis and a worldwide basis. Another reason to bother with small-scale farming is that actually as small farmers prosper, they helped disproportionately to grow the non-agricultural, non-farm rural economy. And there's a clear recognition that that's something that's very important. And poor farmers, like poor people anywhere in the world, spend a disproportionate share of their money. They're suffering without. And so every little bit that's added gets spent for something that's needed. And so that pattern of spending supports the development of the rural non-farm economy. So the summary statement there, again, not to go off into a lot more detail, is that everyone wins with small farm development. As we can help small-scale farmers prosper, everybody benefits. So what are the objectives that I've highlighted for this morning? One is to advance your thinking about small-scale farming as a system. That will become apparent in just a bit. Another is to increase your awareness of both risk and leverage in the context of small-scale farming, and to identify two complementary tools that go with this kind of system understanding that are simple and yet can be very powerful. So let's get started. The core of the small-scale farming system is the family farm. And the core element of the family farm is labor. That's the main ingredient, that's the economic element that small-scale farmers have the most of. It's their personal labor. In most cases, of course, it's not just the man and the woman in the family. It often involves the children as well. We add to the labor capital. Now, in this context, I'm going to define capital a little more broadly than we typically think about it. Here, capital would include not just tools and equipment that they might have on the farm, but farm structures, if they've got like seed storage bins, other corrals for animals. It would include animals, livestock, goats, cattle, trees, seed that is retained for planting the next crop cycle. Anything of economic value that is invested in to gain some future return here is considered capital. Labor may be one of the ingredients that is invested to develop that capital. So if you build a pond to provide a reservoir to increase your water supply after the rainy season, the labor that goes into it is investing in the development of your capital. Now, typically, as you would expect, labor and capital harnessed together yield your production. Now, this production, as we move forward, may go in a couple different directions. One is it may be reinvested in the capital. A very simple way of thinking about this is if you're growing staple crops, some of that crop may be reinvested as feed for livestock. The other part of production, another part of it, may be actually consumed. Obviously, the family needs to grow to eat, and a big part of what is in their diet is what they produce within their farm. So this is in the most elemental framework. This is kind of the family farm structure. Now, as we all know, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. The farm exists in the context of and deploys the natural environment and natural resources. These can be, obviously there's land, there may be trees, water, all kinds of other elements on which they farm and which are essential for them to be able to farm effectively. Some of this environment and natural resources is manageable. The land is manageable. Sometimes the water supply may be manageable. Less manageable are weather and pests and all kinds of other things that are part of the natural environment. The labor and capital is brought to bear on this environment, on these natural resources to yield production. Another important dimension of this is the flow through into the marketplace. Production, some of it may go as reinvestment in capital, some of it may be consumed, but hopefully a significant part of it actually goes to market and is exchanged. Now, once you have marketed some of your products, you have cash. That cash, in turn, may be reinvested in the farm in the form of tools, buying a better storage system for seed or for your other production. It may also be consumed by the family and go back into labor. There's obviously tremendous range of needs that the family will have, many of which can only be met by expending money, cash. Obviously, food. Most small-scale farmers only produce about 46% of what they need to eat, so the rest has to be purchased. But in this category of proceeds from markets that go back into consumption include a lot of other things: clothing, education, healthcare. A lot of the basic elements of life, the family cannot acquire them except by the yield from selling their produce. You see these little lines and arrows keep popping up. Here's another dimension. With the proceeds from marketing, the farming family may actually be able to enhance or expand the natural resources on which they farm. They may be able to add another hectare. They may be able to bring into cultivation some more marginal part of the land that they did already operate. They may be able to invest in some kind of a water retention or distribution system, Chapin drip buckets, for example. An arrow is going out as well to the left of markets and back up to labor. As the farm system grows and the demands for labor, they may actually purchase labor, hire labor out of the marketplace to enable them to operate their farm more effectively. There's a significant wrinkle that is growing in importance in small-scale agriculture around the world, and that is the reverse flow, that the labor on small-scale farms may actually flow back into the marketplace. And the laborers may actually be looking for work elsewhere and be hired. Their labor would be hired back into factories, to farms, to food production facilities in their region. That will obviously be significant because it's drawing the main economic agent out of the small-scale farming system and putting it into another system. It has the benefit of potentially bringing finances back into the family, but it drains away important labor resources. That stream has also accelerated generationally. I think we're all quite aware of the fact that youth have been leaving the rural areas in droves and going to the big cities, hoping for a better life, bored with what exists in the rural areas and the lack of options. Oftentimes, these young people find nothing of benefit to do in the cities, but they have left the farms, and oftentimes the practices and the learning doesn't then get transferred to the next generation. Now, I want to highlight the fact that in every one of these areas, all these core elements in this system, there is significant uncertainty and or risk. Now, I'm not going to parse those two words. I'm just going to lump them together and recognize that for various reasons, these risks and uncertainties are very prevalent in each of these elements. We know them from the environment, from the natural resource area. We already mentioned weather, pests, drought, climate change. All of these factors are playing on the context in which the family conducts their farming. And this introduces huge risks, huge uncertainties into their enterprise. In the area of capital, you can have disease, which can cause loss of livestock. Disease also that affects trees, and especially fruit trees. You may actually have theft of your animals or your trees. So a lot of things can happen to the capital that these scarce resources of labor and money have been invested in this small-scale farming system. You move to production, and we know very well the uncertainties that come into play in the basic farming enterprise in terms of what your labor is going to yield. You see an arrow beneath production and before markets. That is really focusing on that kind of post-harvest phase where you can have complications in harvesting, poor timing, weather events that happen just as your crop has matured or has begun to dry out and is ready for harvest. We all know that there is incredible post-harvest loss of staples, main grains. It's calculated that generally about 30% of that is lost post-harvest. Fresher vegetables and fruits, it goes between 45 and 50% is often lost. So some of that is just poor practices, but some of it is because of the uncertainties and risks that are inherent to that process. You'll see there's an arrow there pointing to markets. There are huge risks and uncertainties for small-scale farmers, particularly those out in more rural areas, because they don't know what the market is for what they're trying to sell. Oftentimes, their capacity or their perceived capacity to sell is dictated by whoever comes down the road with the truck around harvest time and offers to buy their produce. And we all know horror stories of people who have received pennies on the dollar in terms of the value of their produce as they have been fleeced by people that have come down the road. So lack of information on market pricing introduced significant uncertainties into this system. There are significant uncertainties as well on the left side of that market as you move toward the labor side, both because it's not clear what they should pay if they hire labor. If they try to be creative and hire labor on some kind of a risk-return mechanism where they share part of the produce, that is either a risk that, in fact, the farmer is doubling down on his harvest, or a laborer is choosing to share in the risk with the farmer. There's also a significant uncertainty as you move up that curve in terms of what actually somebody from the farm that is going to work in some other kind of enterprise, what they actually will gain. Not only what they're going to be paid, if they're going to be paid, what it will cost, what will be taken from them to provide housing or meals or transportation. So what actually will be returned into the family system to provide for the needs of the family is highly uncertain. Finally, as you move up to the labor box by itself, you have huge risks and uncertainties at play there. One very simple one relates to health. If your labor is the husband, the wife, and their kids, if people get sick in the family, you very readily can lose half your labor force. And at certain times of the year, if that happens, you are in big trouble. And in fact, the capacity of your labor is typically most reduced when it's needed most. You know, we're all, or many of us are familiar with what they call the hungry months. It's the time kind of after planting and before harvest when most of the food has been consumed. The family budget is the resources are near the bottom, maybe moving into deficit. And yet the work of weeding and maintaining the fields is increasing at the time of greatest heat. And the people don't have food to eat or not adequate food to eat, maybe not adequate water accessible to them. And so their capacity to work is dramatically reduced at the time it's needed most. So all of these things, health-related things, dietary, nutrition issues, come in to significantly increase the risks and uncertainties in the labor component of the family. I just want us to pause. This is pretty subtle. But just to pause for a minute and appreciate a few things. One is the complexity of this system. The family farm, this small-scale farming system, is remarkably complex. All of these risks and uncertainties are brought to bear on the family, and it's no wonder that we keep running into risk aversion. You know, we've got great ideas of what people should do, and we are sometimes impatient with small-scale farmers who don't so readily glom onto our ideas and go full bore to implement them. When you understand the risks and uncertainties that already define their lives and their systems, it's no wonder that we run into risk aversion. I also want us to pause because hopefully all of this will help us to move into this work, to move into our teaching and sharing with a significantly greater degree of humility. None of us in this room live with a fraction of the risks and uncertainties and the pressures that most small-scale farmers live with day in and day out. And so I think it warrants a much greater degree of humility in us as we begin to try to work to help reduce hunger and improve livelihoods among small-scale farmers. So with all this, where do we go? Well, first of all, I think we need to tailor our strategy to the people we're trying to serve. One important thing to understand is the kind of small-scale farmer that you are engaging. It's estimated that worldwide, about half of small-scale farmers are basically subsistence farmers. The other half are involved at some level in selling and trading. Most of them locally or regionally, some of them into the international market. So we want to tailor our strategy to the farmers and circumstances that exist in the area where we're working. And I think we also want to recognize something really important. To me, this is where it becomes empowering. That every area of risk and uncertainty is a potential leverage point. It's an opportunity for us, working with small-scale farmers, to make a difference. Again, this is the system. And in the area of environment and natural resources, what are some of the leverage points there? We could make pages of lists for these. One general thing is working on land tenure. It's, people can't invest multi-years in the development and improvement of their soil, in development of trees in their farms, even livestock, if they live this tenuous existence of whether or not this land that they're working is going to remain accessible to them year after year. So land tenure reform and laws are an important way to leverage the needs and the opportunities, some of the risks, I should say, in the area of environment and natural resources. An intervention that's growing in popularity, sand dams are a way to work within the environment and natural resources to reduce some of the risk and improve the possibility of farmers to increase their yields and reduce the risks that they will actually have the production that they seek. Again, each of these, I'm just going to name a few things. You will be able to, or we can this afternoon, spend a lot more time filling out a lot more of the options. In the area of capital, there's a whole variety of interventions that can reduce some of the risks and uncertainties there. One is better seed storage systems. If people are saving back their production in order to plant for the next year, if that seed is stored better, not only will you have a lot less losses in that seed stock, but the germination rates will remain much higher. Vaccination programs. Erwin Kinsey is here, and he's been educating me about Newcastle diseases in chickens and how very simple vaccination program can reduce your losses in chickens dramatically and have a huge impact on the benefits that families enjoy from those small animals. We learned yesterday about orchard management. That's a key way, learning better practices to take care of trees. Woodlots, there are a lot of things that people can learn that can actually help preserve and increase the benefits that you gain from your capital investments while reducing risks and uncertainties associated with those. In the area of the production, many of the agricultural practices that we're talking about this week can have a huge impact on production and on yields. There's also a growing development of an insurance market in some developing contexts so that small-scale farmers actually can insure at a very, very modest level, but can insure their harvest. Again, this arrow points to that kind of post-production, which includes harvest and marketing, preparing for market area. Lots of the risks and uncertainties there can be addressed by better training around harvest timing and practices, post-harvest storage. One of the intriguing ideas I came across in research recently is some new systems that are being developed for warehousing, where actually in rural areas, larger warehouses are made available for rural farmers to store their goods, and they can deposit their goods there. There is no charge for them to do that. They can then decide, as they see the market develop, if they want to pay a modest rent and retrieve their stock and sell it, or if they want to go ahead and just sell it to the warehouse management company, who again will then put it back into the system. So there's a way for farmers there to have good quality storage of their seed and be able to potentially realize the increase in the value of that product as the time lapses from harvest. Another whole way to impact some of the risks and uncertainties in that area between production and markets is transportation systems. Small-scale rural farmers have a huge problem. There are significant costs, and one of the reasons that they're over the barrel oftentimes for these guys that come down the road and will buy their production is because there are no practical or affordable avenues available to them to get their produce to market. Markets, I mentioned one of the risks and uncertainties there is, what is your crop actually worth? If you're going to sell it, what should you be selling it for? And when we were in West Africa some months back, interesting to talk with a group of people that had developed a system of providing texts. So a farmer, the day that he knew one of these guys was going to be coming down the road to buy whatever they had harvested and bagged up, they could send a text to a certain number, put in a code that related to their crop, and it would text them back what the sale price was that day for that crop. And so instead of being at the mercy of whatever the guy coming down the road wanted to pay, they actually had some knowledge, some information that would enable them to negotiate. It had given them some power and some leverage in that process. There are also, in many crop areas, coffee and cocoa are two of the main ones. There are marketing associations where people come together to help small-scale farmers not only tap technical resources, maybe tap lending capital, loans, but also an ability to gather their product and increase their market leverage for selling. On the labor side, again, we talk about providing health care, providing immunizations to people, better nutrition support, and labor market information in a similar way to the crops, knowing what should you be paying for labor, what's the going rate for hiring labor. If you're going to sell your labor out, what can you charge? And so market information, making that more readily available to small-scale farmers is hugely helpful. So where do we go from here? Well, the sessions that we're having this week and the afternoon and evening talks as well address a wide range of these impact opportunities. But again, back to the strategy and focus, a possible focus for subsistence farmers is those types of interventions and practices and tools that will help them increase their yield and maybe bring about a little bit of diversity in their production. Because again, you remember that if you're a subsistence small-scale farmer, you're not thinking about the market. You're not oriented toward the market. You're trying to survive. And so if we can help small-scale farmers in that situation produce enough food to provide adequately for their families, in fact, more than their families need, it begins to draw them into the marketplace. And as they sell even into their neighbors or the local area, their surplus production, a whole new range of opportunities begin to open to them and to you as you work with them to see the potential to improve their livelihoods as they increase their production. If we're focusing on farmers that are engaged at some level in selling and trade, I want to suggest a few basic things. One is that we encourage them to diversify, and again, that we talk about that a lot here, not just in type of crop, but in timing. If you spent much time in any part of the developing world, you will see that time of year when cabbages or tomatoes are abundant. And they are so prevalent that, in fact, farmers can't give them away. And most of the farmers have no way to store or preserve that product, so unless they can consume it, it ends up going to waste. If you can help people maybe seed up, a month or 6 weeks early, and so they're planting seedlings rather than seeds, and you can bring your tomatoes to market a month before everybody else, you're going to be able to attract prices for your tomatoes that are far superior to what you're going to gain if you're producing tomatoes at the same time everybody else does. That's just one example, but looking for seeds and varieties that yield on a slightly different time frame from the norm in your area can provide huge advantages in the marketplace. A second idea there is to reverse the dominant mindset. Most small-scale farmers say, my challenge is to figure out how to sell what I produce. You can reverse that mindset and say, how can I produce what will sell? And so spending time in the market, figuring out what demand is, what do people want, and when is that not available at a time that you might be able to make that available. So it's reversing the dominant mindset to what can I produce that people want to buy. Kind of a next step beyond that is the idea of switching seats. Thinking about our consumer and saying what's important to them about the products that they might buy from us. I'm going to give you an example about that in a minute after I go through these next two. Look for win-win opportunities, ways that not only you and the purchaser can benefit, but maybe other people in your community. And closely related to that is finding opportunities to capture value added. And value added is a huge subject area, and there's a lot of good material. And again, that will come up in many talks during this week. But let me just give you a little example that ties together these last three items. I was talking about some of these issues a few months back at ECHO, and in the class was a young man from Guatemala. And he was very excited after the class to tell me his experience. He lived in an area that wasn't too far from the Lake District, and there were a fair amount of tourists that came through there. And so restaurants had grown up in response to those tourists, and a lot of these tourists love salads or greens with their food, lettuce greens. He was in an area where he could grow lettuce. He also had a fairly abundant supply of clean water. So he began selling his lettuce to these restaurants, and because that's what they wanted, he had reversed the dominant mindset already. Then he switched seats. He began to think about